want to say real quick about both tonight's meeting, one thing, and then before I do too, okay, I see Jana back there. I want to say something about Bobby and Jana. Every Sunday they're here early, and they make breakfast, and they show up with coffee, and they know what everybody takes in their coffee who's here getting ready, and that's not a official position, they just do it. And not only that, but I could not mention that without also mentioning as well, up until probably about a month ago, Nate and I would show up early, and we would have to vacuum the sanctuary, we'd have to vacuum the fellowship area, we'd have to clean up anything that needed to be cleaned up. And over the last month or more, maybe 2 months now, Jimmy and BJ come in, and they completely vacuum everything. They mop the floor. We walked in this morning, it smelled clean. It was beautiful, even down to the bathrooms. So I want y'all to know how much they do and how much we appreciate everything that y'all do. And then about tonight, this is not for members only members can vote, but this is really an important time of our year where we communicate to you, like if you're always like, we don't know what they do with their money, well, tonight's the night, okay? This is where we present what we did with our budget this year, what our budgets look like for the upcoming year. It's where we present some of the projects we'd really like to focus on this year. It's where you hear about our ministries, the things we've done, the things we want to do, the things we feel like we've accomplished. It's a time to ask questions, so it's a big night. So if you can come, join us at 6. I believe we are working on a nursery, and if we cannot find help with children, what we will do is have in-service things for them to do while we're gathered, and then once Bryce gives her report, she'll then take the children and do an activity with them. So please come and support that, especially if you remember we have some things we certainly need to vote on for the upcoming year, and we would appreciate your support in that. Okay, that was all. Whew. What a beautiful worship morning, isn't it? I want to ask you this question. Do all people have morals? Now, based upon your reading of the title of this message, whether you saw it on Facebook or you've come and shown up and seen it on the app, you're probably wondering, where's he going to go with this? And that's probably a good question to ask. So I'm going to do some technical discussion this morning. Now, this is not always my way. For those of you who are new with us, it's not usually my way to try to do things that are kind of technically complicated, but in this series, I'm kind of okay with that. So today is the last of our series on common ground, and then next week we're going to start preparing for Resurrection Sunday. Once we get done with the Easter season, we will move into a series on the book of Matthew to learn more about who Jesus is, kind of in an introductory fashion. So just to kind of prepare you for that. So let's start here. Do all people have morals? Now, this is hard to answer because we don't have access to all people. Perhaps there are some exceptions, but I am willing to bet that most people do, in fact, have morals. Let me give you a way to test this theory. Are you ready? Go out today when you leave here and do something morally questionable to random people. Let me start over. Do all people have morals? This is hard to answer because we don't have access to all people, but I'm willing to bet that most people do, in fact, have a sense of what is morally right and morally wrong, and they believe it. A good way to test this is for you to go out and to do something morally questionable to random people. Let me put some boundaries on that. You can only do things that are morally retrievable. Okay? Let me explain. Suppose you're in a grocery store and you are in a long line, and you're out there testing this theory. Try breaking in front of random strangers and see how they react. You can give them their place back and explain to them that you're doing an experiment on universal morals. This is a morally retrievable act. You can make it right pretty quickly. Okay? However, if you punch someone in the face for no reason, you may get your answer, but it is not something that you can retrieve and explain away. How many of you have ever seen the show, What Would You Do? 15 seasons on ABC, where they set up a situation where there are hidden cameras and they set up a morally questionable scenario. And the goal is to see how people who are seeing this scenario will react. It's a pretty interesting show. I've probably only seen a few of them, but it was interesting enough that I knew exactly what the whole premise of the show was. So here's what you would find if you were to do this experiment. You would find what C.S. Lewis calls the law of the right and the wrong. And I want to read to you a section. This is probably, if you were to pick one Christian book out of the 20th century that will stick forever in Christian literature, it would be this book. And he writes this in the very opening of his book. He says this. He says, everyone has heard people quarreling. Sometimes it sounds funny and sometimes it sounds merely unpleasant. But however it sounds, I believe we can learn something very important from listening to the kind of things that they say. They say things like this: how'd you like it if someone did the same thing to you? That's my seat. I was there first. Leave him alone. He isn't doing you any harm. Why should you shove in first? Hey, give me a bit of your orange. I gave you a bit of mine. Come on, you promised. People say things like that every day. Educated people as well as uneducated, and children as well as grown-ups. Now, what interests me, says C.S. Lewis, about all these remarks is that the man who makes them is not merely saying that the other man's behavior does not happen to please him. He is appealing to some kind of standard of behavior which he expects the other man to know about. And the other man very seldom replies, there's no standard. Nearly always, instead, he tries to make out what he has been doing, that what he has been doing does not really go against the standard, or that if it does, there is some special excuse. He pretends there is some special reason, in this particular case, why the person who took the seat first should not keep it, or that things were quite different when he was given the bit of orange, or that something has turned up which lets him off keeping his promise. In other words, he doesn't say there are no standards. He tries to explain away and justify why he has broken the perceived standard. It looks, in fact, very much as if both parties had in mind some kind of law or rule of fair play or decent behavior or morality or whatever you like to call it, about which they really agreed. And they have. If they had not, they might, of course, fight like animals, but they could not quarrel in the human sense of the word. Quarreling means trying to show that the other man is in the wrong. And there would be no sense in trying to do that unless you and he had some sort of agreement as to what right and wrong are. Just as there would be no sense in saying that a football player had committed a foul unless there was some agreement about the rules of football. This whole series has been about finding common ground. It's been about when we go out and engage our community, what are things for which our community already assumes that we can lean into? We've talked about in previous messages that we have common ground of a pursuit and desire for truth. Every person is invested in truth. We have said that everyone is personally invested and interested in love. And then today we are all invested, as I'm arguing, in what is moral. Let me read to you a passage of Scripture. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here because it's not my purpose, but let me read it to you. It comes from Romans chapter 2. You see, there was a situation, and before I read this, it's Romans chapter 2, verses 12 to 16, but before I read it, there was this situation in which the Jewish people had received revelation. They had received what they called the law, and the law essentially told them how it was that they could live morally faithful in the land that God was giving them. The problem was this often came with the assumption that if you didn't have the moral law the way they had it in the Ten Commandments, therefore you had no access to doing what is right. And Paul challenges that. He says this. He says, everyone who has sinned not having the law will also perish not having the law. And all who have sinned being under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who will be justified. For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts either accuse or even excuse them on that day when, according to my gospel, God judges the secrets of men by Christ Jesus. So let me just explain briefly. And if you have questions about this, I can answer them later. They had been saying, because we have the law, therefore we are saved. We've got it. This is our glory. And Paul's point was just having it isn't enough. But also, just because they don't have the written code like you do doesn't mean that they don't have the ability to perceive what is right. That's what he's saying. This is common ground between us and them. Now, I need to make two distinctions. Here's where things start getting a little complicated, so stick with me. Also, if you have our app, we have all these notes on our app. I'm not saying that everyone agrees on what is morally right and what is morally wrong. That's the first thing. But I am saying that everyone does agree that there is a moral right and a moral wrong. You see the difference? Secondly, I'm also not saying that everyone explicitly agrees that there is a moral right and moral wrong, but that everyone implicitly lives as if it is true. So let me back up. First, I'm not saying that everyone agrees on what is morally right and what is morally wrong, but that everyone agrees that there is a moral right and a moral wrong. This is as true among those who do not believe in God as it is among those that are staunchly religious. People that cease believing in God, and I've had my fair share of these encounters, and people even within my ministry who grow and cease to believe in God, do not typically become less moral, they simply shift. The people that I know that cease to believe or who never believe tend to become advocates for new moral agendas. Such people do not tend to abandon their faith only to say there's no right and there is no wrong. Rather, they begin to feel as if they had been morally wrong all the time that they had been Christians. They now think that it is morally wrong to discriminate against gender re-identification or various forms of sexual orientation. Does everybody hear what I just said there? All right, let me back up and just speak to you. I'm not saying we all agree on what is morally right and what is morally wrong, but that we all agree that something is morally right and something is morally wrong. When people often abandon their faith, when people have never believed, it's not such that they therefore become less morally aware. In fact, I often see that it's just the opposite. Some people, once they, quote, get rid of the shackles of Christianity, now feel like it's wrong for you to discriminate against people who want to re-identify their gender makeup or their sexual orientation. They become staunch advocates of defending these things as if religion has been wrong and it's been oppressive to human culture. So it's not as if there's an abandoning of a moral understanding. There's often a more serious adapting of it, only it's in a different way. Now, I'm also not saying that everyone explicitly agrees that there is a moral right and a moral wrong. In fact, some people will specifically say there's no such thing as a moral right and a moral wrong. Now, this was especially true in about the 50s and the 60s. We had lots of atheists who were coming up in our culture and in our media who were saying, if we really look at there not being a God, then it follows there's also not a moral code that we need to follow. And if there's not a moral code that we need to follow, then there's no ought to life. You know what an ought to life is, right? It's you ought to do such and such. That used to be the way it was argued, not anymore. And even people who argued that way, it was implicitly the same people who would say there's no such thing as something we ought to do. If you broke in line in front of them at Walmart, what would happen? Well, that's not right. Or similarly, you shouldn't force your beliefs on me. Why? There's no ought. You see? Implicitly believing what we don't explicitly believe. Everyone implicitly assumes that you should not cut in line or ignore a drowning child or choose your own comfort over assisting a person in need. I mentioned that there are perhaps exceptions, and there seems to be. We have a term for people that don't have any moral empathy. Psychopath. Literally, this is the definition. Psychopaths are people that we label incapable of empathy and forming loving relationships. However, they can pretend to be charming and loving so that those around them can't always detect their lack of empathy. They are also described as morally insane. A psychopath. Do you know why there was a shift from the atheism that said, if God does not exist, there is no moral code, to now we don't believe God exists, but we also believe somehow, even if we can't explain it, there is a moral code? The reason was because after the 40s, what happened in the 40s? Does anybody know? World War II. And when you interview, even this happened in 2008, somebody interviewed a museum on the Holocaust in Germany. And one of the people who oversaw that museum, they said, how do you justify what happened in the 40s with the Holocaust? And you know what the answer was? We were following the implications of science. We were following the implication. Now, here's what this person was doing. They were justifying their action. They weren't throwing the standard away. They were justifying their action, saying we were simply basing it upon what we knew at the time. And if the only thing that matters is simply to survive and to be the fittest, then what did we have to do other than survive and be the fittest? Today we call that psychopathic. Okay. Now, are you ready? That wasn't even the hard stuff. That was the easy stuff. I'm just introducing it to you. Here's the hard stuff. I'm going to answer two questions here. What are morals exactly? What do we mean? And then secondly, how do we explain them? Now, my goal is not to argue today for Christianity from morals. That's not what I'm trying to do. I want to talk to you at the end of this about how to do evangelism because morality is common to us all. That's where I'm heading, but I want to give you an understanding. What are morals exactly? I'm going to give you three things. You ready? First of all, morals entail persons. Do you know what it means to entail something? You can't have morals without having persons. If you have morals, it automatically means you necessarily have persons involved. Here's why. Persons are beings with self-awareness. Apart from self-aware persons, you sticking with me? I know this is a lot of language. Moral rights and wrongs seem to be meaningless. So just think about it for a second. We do not hold trees morally responsible for falling on us, whereas we do hold lumberjacks morally responsible for dropping a tree on us. You see the difference? Persons are held responsible who are self-aware. Material objects that are not self-aware are not held responsible. To have a moral entails that self-aware, conscious persons are involved. That's the first thing. Number two, morals exist immaterially. We have no physical sensation of a moral right or a moral wrong. We cannot smell it, we cannot taste it, we cannot see it, we cannot feel it. Morals aren't the kinds of things that are contained in something like a rock or a sunset. They seem to be different than the material world. With me so far? Let me give you a third. This one's a little bit more complicated. Morals exist necessarily. This is a philosophical term. When we say necessarily, this is what we mean. Something exists necessarily if it's the case that there's no world in which it couldn't exist. Let me give you an example that I think you'll understand, and then I'm going to do the same thing for morality. Mathematics. How many of you can feel and touch and see mathematics? You can't. You can apply it. You know that if I take two objects up here and I can say how many are here, you know that two is there, but you know that as soon as I remove the objects, mathematics still exists. You understand that if all the material world disappeared, it would still be the case that mathematics exists. There's no world that we can imagine such that if that world existed, mathematics wouldn't prove to be true. 1 and 1 would always be 2. 2 and 2 would always be 4, etc., etc., etc. Well, morals are kind of like that. There is no amount of rearrangements of the parts of the universe such that we can see it not having morals. For instance, even if we subtract human persons, it appears evident that as soon as human persons exist, morality also exists, right? We can't imagine right and wrong being determined by whether or not Benjamin and Stephen are here or not. It seems to be bigger than them. It's a standard that applies even when they aren't present. Okay, you got those? Morals entails persons, morals exist immaterially, and morals exist necessarily. Morals didn't happen just because some material thing came into being. That's what we understand. And I'm not trying to prove that. I'm saying I think that's what we all understand to be the case. Okay, so how do we explain them? If morals exist immaterially and necessarily, in other words, we can't attach them to objects that our senses perceive, but also if we can't imagine a world in which they don't exist, then it follows that they cannot be explained by a material universe. That's our understanding. If material things aren't where morals are contained, and if morals are everlasting, they're necessary, there's no world in which they don't exist. We know that's not the case with the material world. There's a beginning, there's an end. A rock can exist and a rock cannot exist. If that's the case, if there is a time, it appears then that there's a time during which the physical universe did not exist when morals did exist. Are you with me? Human persons also did not exist at one time, and we established earlier that morals entail persons. Now let me state this second thing, and then I'm going to sum that up in a way that's easier to understand. If there is a time when morals exist and the material universe does not, and if morals entail persons, then it follows that an immaterial person exists, and it's hard to imagine what such a person could be other than God. There's the argument, okay? Now, this isn't even my goal. I just want you to understand why when Christians talk about, okay, if there's moral codes that we live by, it kind of seems to follow that God exists. Here's the reasoning. Morals we can't attach to a material thing. We can't imagine a world in which morals don't exist, which means they're everlasting, they're eternal. We also think morals automatically entail persons. Well, if there was a time in which morality existed but the material universe didn't, then at that time another person exists that's not material. Does that make sense? You with me? And it's hard to understand what a person could be like that who's not God. All right, you ready? Just breathe. Just breathe. As Yuri said, you can listen to it again and you can figure it all out. I say all that to say this is not our argument, and then I'm going to talk to you about evangelism, okay? I think it's a wrong argument to say we believe that morals exist just because God commanded them. That's not, I don't think, what Christianity's historical argument is. In other words, just because your parents command you to do something doesn't mean that it's right. Now, they may have the authority to command you to do it, and a parent can be wrong. Having authority isn't simply the means of making it right, okay? So just understand, when we say morality points to a God, this, what I just shared with you, is what I mean. Do I need to go through it again? You're like, please no, don't do it. Do not ever go through that again. Okay, all right. You can talk to me about that later. Morals and evangelism, and here's how we're going to close. I'm going to give you three tips when you think about reaching your community. And let me be really clear. The church has no other mission than to make disciples of Christ. That is what we are here to do. That's what we're here to do. That is our mission. That's why when we leave every week, we see "For the Life of the World" on that wall as you exit this place. Because it's a reminder that when you go out there, this is not about you. This is about you making disciples of them out there. So let me give you three things. How might we utilize the common ground, the universal pursuit of morality? Number one, common ground opens up the conversation. Do you know what Christians have often demonstrated in their conversations with other people about morals? That they can't have a civil dialogue. Often, we demonstrate that instead of building bridges, we build foxholes. Do you know why you build a foxhole? Foxhole? Why? You're afraid. Do you know why you build a bridge? Because you're going to go to the other side. And a bridge provides you a way to bring them back with you. A bridge communicates confidence. A foxhole demonstrates that I'm afraid. Having this conversation with you about something I disagree with you on threatens me. And if you threaten me, I've got to dig a hole and hide. Common ground opens the conversation. Let me state this second one, and then I want to give a little clarity there. Number two, encourage a good conscience in people who don't believe and follow Jesus. Encourage a good conscience. That's scary. But let me tell you this. You will never endanger a person's salvation by encouraging them to have a good conscience. You will never endanger a person's salvation by encouraging them to have a good conscience. I think some of the times the reasons why we dig foxholes and we don't want to build a bridge is because we're afraid that if I tell somebody, I want to encourage you to have a good conscience and I want to have a civil dialogue about this moral issue, we feel like somehow if we do that, if we're not firing cannons, if we're not doing that, then somehow we're okay with what they're doing. That is not the same thing. That is not the same thing at all. you can have a conversation, you can build a bridge without approving what somebody else approves. Encourage a good conscience. You know why? Because I think in the same way that we said this weeks ago about truth, I believe also about conscience. Somebody who truly in their heart wants to do what is right based upon what they know, and we continue to steer them to do best by what they know, is not going to simply steer them wrong. And here's what will often happen, and this is the third thing. When people begin, I believe, to listen to the good that they do know, the truth they do know, I don't think the Lord's not paying attention. When the pursuit of a good conscience in the people in our communities prove difficult, guess how difficult that is? How many of us are good at it? Even Paul said this. Remember he said in Romans chapter 2, I read that earlier, he was like, okay, here's the deal. You had God's written law given to you through Moses, and that law was God's revelation of what He wants your life of faithfulness to look like when you live in the land. But He has not left Himself without witness to those who don't have that. That's what He says. Then He says in Romans chapter 7, here's what it's like even when you have the written code. You know precisely what it is you should do and believe. And He says, here's what I find. When I don't have the Holy Spirit in my life, the good I want to do is not the good I do, but the thing that I don't want to do is the thing that I keep on doing. And I find something at work within me that even though my mind wants to do what is right, I seem to keep failing. Anybody experience that? That should probably be the fourth sermon in Common Ground. Maybe it will be, who knows? Because when the pursuit of a good conscience proves difficult, or when guilt takes over, disciple of Jesus, it is then that you have something significant to offer. Because none of us come to Jesus with a clear conscience. We come guilty. And the most beautiful thing about the gospel is not that we come worthy of it. It's that He offers us forgiveness and love right then and there. Don't so position yourself to other people in your life such that you're not prepared to give them that message when they need it. And if everybody in your life that you're trying to reach is just about butting heads with them and building foxholes and standing your ground, you're going to lose that opportunity to speak it into their life. Church, would you stand with me? Paul he wrote about common ground often. One of the most significant areas he wrote about common ground is found in 1 Corinthians. He understood who he was, and he never vacillated on what he believed or the morals that he held. But based upon who he was engaging, he found common ground. We see him doing this in Acts when it came to truth. We also see him doing this with the different people groups that he encountered. When he says, though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all. I'm just curious, when you think about the people God has called you to reach in your life, how many of you have described it in your heart and mind as being a servant to that person? That I might win more. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win the Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, that I might win those under the law. And to those outside the law I became as one outside the law, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I became all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. And I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. Find your confidence. Let go of your fear. Your confidence will not make you stubborn. It'll make you build bridges. May the Lord be with you, bless you, keep you. Make His face to shine upon you. Make you fearless to proclaim His name, but to build bridges of peace, so that you're the kind of person people want to talk to and ask questions. And we all need help with that. In Jesus' name, amen. You are dismissed. Hope to see you tonight.